So I asked 15,000 people whether they like or dislike Games Workshop, and here are the results. A fairly solid majority in the dislike camp there, and it does beg the question, why do people hate Games Workshop so much? Hello and welcome back to Warspec Tactics, where today I thought it could be interesting to do a bit of an overview of the main issues that the Warhammer community tends to have with Games Workshop itself. And while there's a whole ton of people who are absolutely massively invested in the Warhammer hobby, you might get a fair few people saying that they enjoy the hobby despite Games Workshop rather than because of them, despite the fact that obviously they're the ones who make Warhammer miniatures and sell them. A bit of a disconnect between the company supporting a hobby and the hobby existing in its own right. GW certainly has done plenty to tick people off over the years, and we'll go through a few of them in some juicy details in a second, but I would say a few caveats. Go back 10 years, and I think by just about every measure they were a worse company than they are now. People complain about game balance at the moment, but try playing at the tail end of 7th edition for a whole new experience in rampant power creep and broken rules left, right and centre. And they previously basically had no communication with the community whatsoever, didn't support their game, had fewer releases overall, worse communication, and even they had that infamous statement where they said we don't really do market research as we're in a niche community, which I think was fairly telling as to not really reacting to what people wanted to see. On top of that, again, while some of the things that they do are annoying, I do feel that at least a bit of it's attributable to them being a big company that needs to please shareholders, and perhaps expecting them to act any differently to a big company is maybe just a little bit unlikely. They are kind of duty bound to their shareholders to be profitable, even though that's at odds with getting us cheaper miniatures, and though they have had some controversy in the past with employees, they are a UK company that treats their staff a lot better than some companies around the world. At least they're not exploiting desperate people on minimum wage halfway around the world to work in sweatshops to make their products. I feel there are just some greater evils out there than a hobby company not giving fans as good service as they could. Finally, and I think it is worth noting as well, that in general they do have a reputation for doing some things very well indeed. The lore and setting of the 40k universe is pretty awesome, and they've managed to maintain and expand it over the years, adding more and more depth to it between their miniature games, lore, and various other bits. In my opinion, their miniatures are still great quality. It does vary kit to kit, and of course they're pretty pricey, which we'll get onto, but a lot of their recent releases have been very nice indeed, at least in my opinion. And finally, if you need to return damaged things from them, or things were missing in the box, they're generally pretty generous on the customer service side of things. The anecdotes that I've heard about that tend to far outweigh the negatives. Overall, while I think it's fun and pretty useful sometimes to have a bit of consumer pushback against big companies and not doing things the way we'd like them to, I think it's maybe just a bit sad to let hatred define your entire hobby. Particularly when now more than ever there are more routes to playing Warhammer and war games in general without going through Games Workshop. Options like slowing down purchases, making use of 3D printed or third-party alternative models, and even entire separate non-Games Workshop rule sets, like one-page rules Grimdark Future. Still though, let's jump into it and talk about some of the things that have made people most angry at Games Workshop. First up, and perhaps one of Games Workshop's most recent and controversial moves, was their Games Workshop versus fan animators situation here on YouTube, and it's particularly one that you hear about talked about here, though perhaps might be a little bit less widely reported beyond the platform. Plenty of people have their own takes on this, but my rough understanding is this. Games Workshop decided to launch their Disney Plus style subscription service called Warhammer Plus, perhaps the main flagship draw being a whole load of digitally produced animation content, plus a bunch of extra stuff including a model each year, a few YouTube style shows, a voucher and some written material. It seems that somewhere along the process Games Workshop decided to try and take down YouTube as a competitor for their animated content and basically buy out some of the competition in an offer that they can't really refuse. It seems that they approached basically a whole ton of content creators out there, including names like Astartes, Sodas, The Last Church and several others, giving them a gentle reminder that they were basically making content off someone else's IP, something that they weren't really allowed to do, and then quietly asking them if they want to do it on Warhammer Plus instead, as an official part of Games Workshop, where they would be allowed to create their content. Most of these creators were people who generally just wanted to share their passion projects to start with, though some had become quite lucrative, but basically all of these projects went silent for a bit before basically announcing that they were going as part of Warhammer Plus, and in general a lot of people weren't particularly happy. It was certainly a bit sad to see a whole load of really quality content removed from YouTube in a place that everyone could find it, and either reposted to Warhammer community, or its release delayed and released on Warhammer Plus behind a paywall, where few people are going to ever organically find it. I don't think people were disputing that Games Workshop were within their legal rights to do this, but it was just seen by many as a bit of a vindictive and backward step perhaps. These content creators were basically making great big adverts for Warhammer and getting more people into the hobby, as well as giving current fans other things to enjoy, and Games Workshop basically intervened and put a big spanner in the works for a whole thing, driving plenty of content creators away from making Warhammer content, such as Soda's and Brother Alpha Buse's text-to-speech device series, though that's kind of still going under a non-40k rebrand. I can see the logic of the moves that they made from Games Workshop's perspective, but I think there's not a lot that Warhammer fans are going to like less than seeing a lot of talented fans having their passion projects removed or destroyed. And at least here on YouTube it does remain one of the single biggest things that people talk about when they say why they don't like Games Workshop as a company. Perhaps one of the other single most common complaints about Games Workshop's practices are their prices, and with Warhammer having such a dominant share of the tabletop wargaming market, it has allowed them to set some fairly hilarious costs for their little plastic army men. A lot of people might have been inured to it from being in the hobby for a while, but you might often surprise people who aren't familiar with Warhammer with just how much one little model soldier can cost. It's definitely not a new issue, this has been going on for decades now, and it's certainly much worse in some areas around the world than others. Say the USA, Australia and New Zealand are particularly hard hit, and I'd argue that particularly in Australia and New Zealand, Games Workshop's high prices are a big factor that limits how big the community grows for their products. I think this one comes up time and again just because there's a general feeling of model soldiers shouldn't really cost this much. In terms of production costs, making any one box of Warhammer must be absolutely tiny in terms of raw materials and the production used. In general, I imagine the majority of the profits from those things go to things like, say, store upkeep, designing, producing and maintaining molds for really quite a big range, and warehousing and logistics. Still though, as with just about any company, the prices really are set by what people are prepared to pay, with perhaps a little nod to not wanting to shrink the size of the community too much so they still have plenty of customers. Maybe it's not too unexpected with a big company with shareholders and quarterly reports and things, but often when Games Workshop does release new prices, it's the time for a big wince. I feel that perhaps the prices can get quite so high because there's just a whole ton of people that are going to be invested in Warhammer almost regardless, just due to the lore and setting that they've built up over the year, and massive fan love for the setting and investment that's already there. It perhaps can make spiralling prices just particularly painful for people who really want to play but simply can't afford to. A lot of people in that situation are going to blame Games Workshop for that. For the tabletop game, things like rulebook costs and supplement books are another cause of people not being too impressed. Codexes have a pretty short shelf life when they refresh the edition every 3 years or so, and for someone who plays a bit more casually, keeping up with just the paper rules of the game can be a bit annoying, and can also feel a bit disheartening when changes are made to them with things like balanced data slates and FAQs. I'd say over recent years they have done some things a little bit better. They do offer more value sets that allow people to break into certain factions for a little bit cheaper, things like their combat patrol boxes, and over the last year or so they have been starting to release a few of their models at slightly lower prices than before, things like those new Horus Heresy kits at similar or lower prices to their current range. I feel like that might be a nod to them realising that they just can't keep on charging higher and higher for things, particularly when people are struggling with cost of living things at the moment, though I wouldn't be too surprised if they do have further price rises next year with all the inflation. I would bear in mind at least as well, in terms of models, if you look after them quite well, Warhammer does tend to have at least a fairly decent resale value if and when you're done with it. Unlike at least a few hobbies out there, once you've finished and decided to get out of Warhammer, if you decide to stop, there's a good chance that model soldiers that you own will still be worth quite a lot, even massively in the future. Moving on, I thought we'd talk about a few things for Warhammer 40k, the tabletop game in particular, perhaps Games Workshop's flagship product, though admittedly they do have plenty of other things going on. Perhaps one of the single most talked about things, at least in 9th edition, is their game balance. Again, like the prices, maybe something that's never really been particularly good in just about all of 40k's history, and perhaps in particular throughout most of 9th edition has just been a bit of a joke, despite their new system of balance passes and changing points. For the first 2 years of 9th edition, the system has been basically the last codex or the last couple of codexes tend to be the strongest by far, and everyone else is just significantly weaker. People have been getting really tired with this, with the constant codex creep. We've had Space Marines, Death Guard, Admech, Drukhari, Grey Knights, Orcs, Toadies, Tau, Harlequins and Tyranids all absolutely dominate the game in one way or another at their time, and then all of which have been nerfed in one way or another. It just got a bit predictable, and I feel like there's been so much community backlash against this that Games Workshop are actually genuinely trying to take this in hand now. Over the past 3 months or so, the last few codex releases have been far more balanced. The Night Ones, Chaos Space Marines and Chaos Demons. Leagues of Votann looked like they were about to completely upend that trend, but then even before they've properly released, Games Workshop decided to rebalance them and try and put them somewhere more mid-tier as opposed to the new auto-win faction. It's kind of refreshing to see them do that. They did what looked like a fairly genuine apology regarding the Leagues of Votann change, seemed to have been accepting refunds for anyone who wanted to return their set due to that, and now, at least in my opinion, in terms of army versus army game balance, this is about as good as I've seen 40k over the past 15 years or so of playing. Currently the majority of armies stand a chance against the top dogs, which just simply hasn't been the case for much of 40k's history, and particularly not during 9th edition with one broken codex after another. I'm certainly not saying that there isn't a lot of room for improvement. Several of the codexes remain very weak, particularly Space Marines, Admech and Guard at time of recording, and quite a lot of codexes that can still compete do tend to have one or two good builds and not a lot else. There's an awful lot of scope for increasing the internal balance of codexes and giving them multiple ways to play. It's still going to be something that people complain about for one reason or another. There's certainly games out there that are better balanced than 40k, but in general I'd argue that at least in the last few months the general trend has been upwards for this particular gripe. Still though, I think it's going to take a long time for Games Workshop to shake the perception of changing rules to sell models, particularly newer ones, and I feel like even if they did balance the game really quite well, there'd still be the advantage of pay to win to some extent. If you get more models, then you're going to have more choices, and that is going to put you at an advantage compared with players who own less. Kind of one of the drawbacks of having a game system that's fundamentally linked to buying models, I suppose. Overall though, definitely one of the most common complaints about Games Workshop. It's just not good fun turning up to a game and knowing that you absolutely have no chance against the latest overpowered thing, or because Games Workshop have neglected your army's rules and they're just completely inferior to other factions. Again, for current 40k at the moment, quite apart from game balance, there does just seem to be a general rumbling of dissatisfaction around 9th edition, perhaps a bit of the shine falling off for people who started either during 8th or the start of 9th. At least in my experience, I do feel like these complaints aren't really all that focused, but maybe just generally annoyed with the addition at the moment. I would like to see big changes happen of one sort or another. I think perhaps the most universally agreed on thing is that 9th edition has an awful lot of rules to remember, and it's kind of bloated with the things that people need to learn, both from a core rules perspective and within the very dense and detailed codexes. The core rules are basically the 8th edition ones with a whole bunch of tweaks and improvements added on. Almost everything that you look at I think could be argued to be a direct improvement on the previous, but with quite so many bolt-ons and rules quirks, it does mean that if you haven't seen them built up over time, then it can be quite daunting to get into for a new player. Add that to the codexes, and I do feel that the 9th edition dexes really have done quite well to capture the spirit of most of the armies, at least in terms of a rules perspective, even if they do need to do a bit more to make sure that all models are a bit more playable. Just take any one army and they've got a whole choice of different sub-factions to play from, something that didn't exist in previous editions, cool warlord traits and relics for your commanders, special stratagem moves that they can pull in game, and fun points cost upgrades, say for example, or custom jobs for bolting on extra things to your vehicles. Most of it I'd argue is good stuff, but when you need to try and learn all of it and keep it somewhat memorised for other factions as well, it just becomes very hard to manage as a sum total. I feel like there's always going to be some positives and negatives to a more streamlined or more in-depth game. Both have their advantages, more nuance and depth compared with ease of play, but it's kind of hard to have both. Otherwise, for more specific things that might divide opinions a bit, stratagems aren't enormously popular, but some people do like them. I think the general consensus is that trying to remember all of your opponent's stratagems is a bit unreasonable. I wouldn't be surprised if the amount that you can take is reduced in 10th. Secondary objectives were something that Games Workshop borrowed from the competitive scene. I would argue that they lead to more balanced games overall, but that does come at the price of a lot of faff and a lot of bookkeeping when you're trying to keep a model game going. Again, some people like them, a lot of people will be happy if they went away and never came back. We've already mentioned the balance issues and codex creep. Releasing all the books individually throughout an edition is what Games Workshop's likely to do, but it certainly doesn't help keep factions on any sort of level playing field. And some people are annoyed at the pace of change, often saying that things are coming too fast and too quickly for updating 40k. People who play it irregularly really don't have much hope of keeping up, seeing as many things could have changed by the next time they pick up some models, but then you have lots of people who would absolutely prefer Games Workshop to fix problems early and make rules changes to rebalance armies quicker rather than wait for ages. Finally, quite a lot of people have a bit of nostalgia for previous editions as well, saying that various different rules were done better in one era or another, though again might have different opinions as to exactly which rules they'd like to see return or brought back. Overall, I feel like Games Workshop gets a lot of negative sentiment for style of game type complaints like this, but genuinely I feel like they're in a fairly tough spot here. I don't think anyone could design a game that would please everyone, and it might not be all that obvious when you're seeing an acceptable middle ground. Perhaps another common criticism of Games Workshop is the choice of models that they choose to put out for their games, and in particular for 40k and favouring Space Marines more than other factions. It's a bit of a positive feedback loop from Games Workshop. Space Marines sell well as they're the poster boys for the faction, so they make more Space Marines as they'll sell well, and then attract even more Space Marine players because their faction is so much better supported than other armies. I feel like this sentiment waxes and wanes over time. It's not something that's commonly complained about so much right now due to having it been a while since the last Space Marine release, but I'm sure we'll get one in the not too distant future and it'll flare up all over again. It was particularly strong around when Indomitors came out and Space Marines got a massive army overhaul after having received loads and loads of models throughout 8th edition. Again, and at least compared with at least sometimes in the past, I feel like Games Workshop have been actually trying to hit the factions that really need some updates. And within 8th and 9th edition, we have seen some fairly generous releases for most of the Xenos factions and most of the Chaos ones. For major releases within those editions, we've seen a big one for Orcs, Eldar, Necrons, Chaos Space Marines a couple of times now, Death Guard realised as their own faction at the start of 8th, and Genestealer cults fleshed out massively. Guard and World Eaters are also soon. Perhaps some armies that have gone a while without a really big wave of releases might be Tau, Tyranids and Thousand Sons, and I feel like Drukhari probably needed to be added to that as well, seeing as they had quite a lot of their Finecast models removed. In particular, I feel like Tyranids have gone a very long time without any meaningful model support, although I guess their range isn't too terrible. I think if they haven't had a release in a real long time though, there's at least a reasonable chance they're going to be one of the next targets for one. I would also say that despite Eldar getting a rather good clutch of models earlier in the year, they probably still need another similar sort of size release to catch up with the other factions. They still have an awful lot of Finecast Aspect Warriors and other relics in their range. Again though, maybe not too hard to understand why people are going to be a bit more annoyed when Space Marines get another big model wave release ahead of some of these other factions that haven't seen new models in a big way for years. Finally, for a short quickfire round of other dramas that have annoyed people, we've had the recent weirdness surrounding Cursed City. They built this up as a new game system for their Warhammer quest, hyped it up for weeks and weeks, and then basically sold the box out instantly, dropped all support from it, and gave us absolutely no explanation as to why. I'm sure something went very, very wrong behind the scenes, whether it was something legal or something to do with manufacturing, but I feel like anyone who'd got hyped up or bought that game was just very unhappy with Games Workshop's lack of communication. And even if they'd come out and said something like, sorry, due to factors beyond our control, we're not able to support this at the moment, we hope you understand, then I feel like that would have earned them at least a little bit of goodwill. It just felt like they tried to hide and cover it up though, which is sort of hard to do once you've been hyping up a product for weeks and weeks. I must admit I've not been following it too hard since. I did hear somewhat anecdotally that there was another upgrade expansion set that got quietly pulled as well. If you know more about that, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Otherwise, for past dramas, the launch of Age of Sigmar itself was pretty controversial when it first came out. The old Warhammer Fantasy game was kind of dying, so Games Workshop took the rather drastic decision to blow the world up and start with a new one. Obviously, that doesn't exactly go down great with people who have spent a whole load of time and effort making armies for the old system. On top of that, it was a very weird game at launch, basically aimed to be a casual gaming system with no set of points or anything, just turn up with the models that you choose, and maybe it just felt a little bit lazy on their part not even to offer a pretense of a system to try and make games a little bit balanced. Admittedly, Age of Sigmar really has paid off quite well for them. It's doing far better in terms of players than Fantasy ever did, and it's kind of cool that they're now going to be revisiting the Fantasy Old World in a bit of a retro spin-off. I'm sure there's still plenty of people out there who haven't forgotten that though, and still bear a grudge for blowing up an old setting. Going back a long time, there was the case when Games Workshop basically took the Chapter House miniature makers to court, and this perhaps did a lot to cement people in their minds that they weren't afraid to bring the might of their legal team to bear on smaller creators. Chapter House basically being some independent model makers that did seem to try and tailor their releases to gaps in Games Workshop's range. It was maybe a bit embarrassing for them as well, as they lost the rights to some of the things they were claiming were their IP, but they did shut down some parts of the studio and basically crush the business, and it didn't take off again. Over 8th and 9th edition as well, there have been a fair few instances of box sets that feel like they're a bit like Fear of Missing Out box sets, limited runs that are often quite exciting models at fairly decent discounts that basically go up for pre-order over a weekend, before sometimes selling out in minutes as they didn't make enough supply. They get to make some fairly efficient profits as everything that they make sells out, but for a lot of people it means that the only way to get the box if they want it is through things like eBay scalpers, and pay far more than the Games Workshop prices. Perhaps two of the most obvious cases of this were the Indomitors box and the Piety and Pain box set, Sisters vs Drukhari. They did wind up doing another print run of the Indomitus box, which helped people a bit, but still that was a lot delayed compared with most people getting the boxes at the start of 9th. I guess it was some sort of combo of badly estimating demand, global supply chain shortages, and Brexit uncertainty that made things a bit tricky. Kind of hard to say what the biggest impacts were unless you were on the inside, but it was quite annoying for hobbyists, again being teased with something that they really want to get, and then Games Workshop basically making it impossible for you to buy the thing. It doesn't seem to be quite as big of an issue now, they seem to be anticipating demand a little bit better, but still it's something that doesn't always go to plan for them. Finally, and again something that I feel that in general they've got a lot better on, is poor communication with their fanbase. This maybe is a bit of a relic from when Games Workshop was a bit more of a monolithic company that just didn't interact at all. At least now they have social media presence, their Warhammer community team, and actually have been speaking quite openly about some of the things that they do. Say for example when they talked recently about 40k game balance and that apology for the mess up with the Leagues of Votann. Still though, while things are better than they were, they still do earn themselves some negative points for this, things like having all the comment sections for their YouTube videos turned off, filtering out some certain critical comments on their Facebook posts and things, and still sometimes just not being very open and honest about issues with fans, say for example with Cursed City. So overall I'd say a fair amount of contentious points, where Games Workshop's and the fans' interests maybe don't align perfectly, some areas that they're making progress on, some areas where they're arguably not, and despite their failings I would still give them credit for making cool lore and cool models. I'll be interested to hear your guys' opinions though. Do you like Games Workshop or do you not? Let me know your answers and why down in the comments below. I know that plenty of the discussion on this has been fairly opinion heavy, it's kind of impossible for it not to be, but I'm certainly more than happy to hear alternative takes. If you've enjoyed the video then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the Warhammer 40k content coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that is what allows me to keep all these videos coming quite so regularly. If you are enjoying quite a lot, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.